News to step forward to present the budget workshop.
All right, good afternoon. We'll jump right in. This is our first budget workshop for next year, for FY20. It marks the start of a 10-month process that will culminate with final budget adoption September 4th of 2019. So we're just getting started. The purpose of today's workshop is really to provide the board kind of a budget outlook, a revenue forecast based on kind of the limited information we have at this point, review the board's budget priorities from last year, and allow the board some time to review those and give any input and see how we may need to adjust if needed for the upcoming budget process, and then just give you a feel of the overall timeline and the work we'll be doing with your budget advisory committee. And just up front, I want to say as we were preparing for this workshop and kind of looking at the budget outlook, I was constantly reminded of A Tale of Two Cities, the opening lines, where it starts out, you know, it's the best of times, the worst of times. I feel like in Palm Beach, it's the best of times. We had the voters approve our referendum, and that's a terrific thing. And then the information coming out of Tallahassee, it doesn't look as bright for the state of education funding. So we're going to share some of that with you today. You know, as this board well knows, the majority of our funding is determined by the legislature and the governor, and that process started in September with the State Board of Education doing their legislative budget request. That's really the first thing. We do have the benefit of the economic and demographic research. It's an arm of the legislature that does all the state budget forecasts. They've done their long-range financial outlook, and by long range, that's really 3 years. And then we're now waiting on the governor's budget proposal, and that's probably going to be a little while because we have a change in governor, and it's also the legislative session this year starts in March. It's 2019, so it's an odd year. It's not an election year, so it'll run from March through May, and then we'll really know where we stand with next year's budget. The board can honestly say now you have done everything you can to help fund education in Palm Beach County. You know, with the referendum for the $1 million. And then the local government infrastructure surtax that generated, you know, we're getting 50% of that money. It's equivalent to a half penny. We've basically done everything we can here in Palm Beach County to shore up funding for both the operating and capital budget. And now the rest of it's really going to depend on what the legislature does for us. On the state budget request, we can't put too much stock in this because if you look at recent history, what the state board has requested has not been funded. They've basically been double what we ended up receiving, and this year is really no different. They requested a $200 increase per student. We've been receiving about $100 per student for the last 3 years. That $200 would be a 2.7% increase. We've been seeing 1.39% for the last couple of years or even less. But some things of note, they did request a $100 million increase in the Safe Schools allocation, so that would be on top of the increase that we saw last year as part of the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas Safety Act. They've requested some additional money for transportation. That is definitely needed. Transportation is woefully underfunded. And then there's a $10 million increase statewide for mental health assistance. So that potentially could complement what we're doing with our referendum dollars. On the capital side, a couple important things. They would continue to fund charter school capital outlay through PICO, entirely through PICO. So this current budget year we're in, there's about $145 million dedicated to that. Next year it'd be $155 million if they followed the state board's recommendation here. And then you may recall the Stoneman Douglas Act had $99 million in one-time money for facilities grants to bolster security and harden the campus. They've recommended another $150 million potential in grant money for next year. And they also have continued the Best and Brightest program as it currently stands for teachers and principals. And they've also continued another $67 million for the Aaron Feist Guardian program, which a lot of that money did not get spent this year. And we've talked about maybe trying to get flexibility to use that for traditional school police officers. But anyway, that was the State Board of Education's request. The State Board of Education, you know, is appointed by the governor. We could see some changes. We could see a changing commissioner of education. You probably followed that in the news as of late. So we'll be paying close attention. And then the longer range financial outlook prepared by EDR. Ms. Knus put this chart together, and I really want to kind of let it sink in a little bit because this chart actually tells our story. And The line at the top is the growth in state general revenue each year. So this is kind of like how the state economy is doing, the state budget in general. And you see that growth, over 5%, and then it's about 3.5% and pretty steady in the next 3 years in the projection. Our budgets, our funding for education have not kept pace with state general revenue. That's part of our challenge. The gray line in the middle is inflation. And inflation, you can see it's starting to uptick, but over 2% now. And then funding for education is projected to increase 1.16% per student each year for the next 3 years. So that doesn't paint a real good picture. If you're not keeping up with inflation, it's going to make it hard to balance our budgets and to take care of our employees and to provide some type of salary increase. So this was kind of the dismal outlook here on the state side. This could change. The EDR does their budget forecast based on, first they figure out the revenue available, and that's pretty solid. They're pretty good about that. Some of their other budget forecasts are based on policies, and they look at the most recent 3 years to see where the legislature has been on things like the RLE and how much they've dedicated to funding. And then that's how they develop their critical and high priority needs. They say, well, if education's been getting by on 1% a year, then I guess we can continue to do 1% a year. So it could change, but there's not a whole lot more money to work with. And when they do things like roll back to RLE, it takes revenue off the table that could otherwise maybe go to improve these numbers. And as an example, if you compared this year's outlook, it's a rolling 3-year outlook. So if you compared this year's outlook to last year's outlook, we actually dropped. The last year's outlook had education funding growing by 1.79% per year. It was the top high critical priority need on the state budget. That chart on the left shows you a $1.9 billion figure. That's what they forecasted they would need to put into K-12 education over a 3-year span last September. This year that's dropped. You see education is now 6th from the top, and they're saying we only need really to put about $582 million of state money into education for the next 3 years. And that's very low when you consider a $20 billion plus state education budget. And part of that's because we did make a little headway on the required local effort. They allowed the value of new construction to roll into that, so they didn't roll it back all the way that they had for a couple of years. They rolled it back for everything except for new construction. So that brought in a little more local revenue, but then they also lowered the expectation of how much per student would be needed, and that's where that 1.16% comes in, and it basically makes their job of balancing the state budget easier if they kind of follow this forecast. And it also, if you look at the 3 years, for year one, which will be our FY20, next year's budget, they've got enough money to work with based on these priorities. There's no deficit. If you look in years 2 and 3, you see about a $48 million deficit in year 2, and then about $456 million deficit in year 3. And those deficits are smaller than they were a year ago. But again, that's not necessarily great news because it means they're changing their assumptions on what's needed, and they're putting less revenue into education. It appears they plan to put less money into education at the state level. This table gives you kind of a good recap too of where we've been, and these are our increases per student for the last 3 years from 1 to 1.39%. But if you look at the bottom there, if you look at the breakdown between how much of the increase was in the base student allocation, which is the money the board has the most flexibility with, that's where you can deal with rising costs, employee salary considerations, that type of thing. And then you look at how much is in categoricals, and that's the money that's really earmarked and mandated how we spend it. More and more money is making its way into the earmarks, and less is going into base student allocation. And last year was probably, just the best illustration of that, with 47 cents going into the base student allocation and $101.03 going into categoricals. And most of that was really tied to the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas Safety Act with safe schools and mental health. All right, so I know that was not the best news, but there is the uptick again. The positive news is our referendum, and we are extremely fortunate. I tell you, if we didn't have this, we'd all be eating turkey and cheese sandwiches for the next 3 years, I guess, right? So a big part of this budget development that's going to be actually fun is that we now have an opportunity to do some good things here and spend that money. The ballot language was pretty prescriptive. We were very transparent and said, it's going to security and safety and mental health and improving teacher pay. And we even got pretty specific on the teacher pay piece, so how that would be done with retention supplements. So that's pretty well spelled out, but there is some work that needs to be done on the fine-tuning exactly how we allocate, for example, some of those mental health services. What type of positions are those? What does that staffing formula look like? We're already working with Chief Kitzrow and his team on, how would we expand our police department to add more police officers and make sure we serve the schools. And, that's going to be the fun part of doing this budget, is that we'll finally be able to address some of these things, and we've got the needs, and now we actually have a way to get them accomplished. The tough thing's going to be everything else, where that's not funded by the referendum. We'll still be under that squeeze, the annual budget squeeze, and we'll probably have to work to communicate that a little bit to our employees in the community that say, yes, it's great we've got the referendum, we're going to do everything we promised, and it's going to be terrific, but if you're working in an area maybe outside of that referendum or whatever, we're still going to be struggling with kind of these really meager state budget increases. So these are your board priorities kind of summarized. We do this each year and put them back in front of the board, but mainly, we have a strategic plan that we're a few years into our strategic plan, so we work hard to try to align our resources to support those initiatives. And then we've got some, things we have to comply with the law. We have to meet class size. The board's been pretty clear that they want to make sure that we do consider, teacher salaries and our ability to retain and attract employees. Fortunately, we're getting a nice shot in the arm with the referendum, but we have other employee groups, and teachers are still, the referendum is the retention supplements. I don't think our teachers are thinking they still want to hope to see some type of raise, maybe on top of that, or from year to year, some type of performance pay salary increase. And then we've got to keep our buildings safe, and the whole capital budget focus of maintaining, getting the deferred maintenance done. And then Ms. Canusa always wants to remind me that we need to keep adequate reserves and protect our credit ratings and all that good stuff. And as the budget grows, we also grow the board's contingency reserve to maintain that compliance with the 3% requirement. And then on just some things to look out for on the legislative front, I believe the board later today is going to approve your legislative platform. I talked a lot about last year the DCD, and I was a little concerned about the study that was being commissioned. I'm a little less concerned. I've had a conversation with the CFO in Dade County, and they're very supportive of that study. And I kind of challenged that and said, I'm concerned because right now we have the highest DCD in the state, so I feel like we are at risk of maybe being knocked down a peg or two. But the DOE is bringing in a consultant, and hopefully they're going to take a real study and look at the cost of living, the true cost of living, and if the study's done right, that Palm Beach County should still be up in the upper ranks of that cost of living adjustment. So we'll have to continue to watch that. I guess I'm just not as worried as I was a year ago, hearing more about how that consultant work may be done. We've got the constitutional amendments. They all passed except for Amendment 1. Amendment 1 was the doubling of the homestead. That did not pass, but everything else passed, including Amendment 5, which was this requirement that any future new tax or tax increase must be approved by a 2/3 supermajority of both the House and Senate. That could come into play with our RLE each year, and it's certainly going to maybe make things tougher to get more revenue on the table for education, so we'll be watching that. We had an issue last year that they incorporated into the FEFP. They put $58 million into the formula to do what they call compression. It was no benefit to Palm Beach County and South Florida and most of the big districts, but it helped some other districts where it propped them up and tried to bring their funding up to closer to the state average. So we don't, when they start, the FEFP is really actually a pretty good formula. And its purpose is noble to try to maintain equity across the state and access for kids across the state to all the programs. But when you see some of these things like the compression allocation, different things where they change it, it kind of distorts the formula and the intent of the formula. And usually that thing was done with very little discussion, and it was to our detriment. It would be better to see that money go into the base student allocation. We'll keep watching the charter school capital outlay funding. We caught a break this year with PICO picking up the tab. Had that not happened, we would have been spending about $16 million of our own money out of our local capital outlay millage. So we want to make sure the state continues to fund that. and we'll keep you posted. Just a timeline, so we're here today to start things. Your Budget Advisory Committee is going to meet right after the winter break, and then we'll have a series of Budget Advisory Committee meetings and board workshops right up until next September. So that completes our presentation. We'd be happy to take any questions.
Mrs. Brill.
Thank you. And so I don't have a question, but I do have some comments. First of all, we know that we are going to probably have, well, not probably, we're going to have the roughest road ahead of us the next few years, undoubtedly with the legislature, with the governor, with the new head of the Department of Education. So I think that we're going to have to be very creative, very bold, and think out of the box. I know this is a preliminary discussion, but, you know, I'm really concerned, and my community, and I don't usually stay District 3 centered, but we're real concerned about the lack of schools, the lack of ability to build. I think we have to go out of the box. I've got a middle school that's at 120% capacity in my district, and I joke all the time about how I only have one high school in District 3. Well, I'm getting those phone calls from parents that live within 1 mile of Park Vista wanting to know how do they get their child in, and I'm saying, well, apply for the choice programs. But I didn't realize that the only choice program is automotive that's open to non-boundaried students. So although we're in the beginning stages of budget, you're going to start hearing me talking about putting aside money for building, even though they're saying, no, you can't. We've got to find ways. I understand there's ways for us to build. The cost for building is not going to be any less. So I want that to be on our radar. The other thing that I'd like to talk about, maybe not tonight, but the impact fees that were discussed at the county commission meeting yesterday. I saw your memo, Mr. Burke, and I'd like to know, you know, how that came about for us, the amount, because I'm already hearing from people in the public that are saying, well, you know, we just gave you the half-cent sales tax, we just gave you the referendum, and now you're wanting to hit us with an impact fee for when you have new developments being built. So we're going to have a deep discussion because we're going to get a lot of pushback, and I know that it's under the county umbrella, but I need to have an understanding of how that came about, how that figure came up, who approved it from the school board, and how long a phase-in. I know we said 2 years, but could that be pushed to 3 or 4?
I'd like to speak to that a little bit. Impact fees in Palm Beach County are low. They were deliberately kind of held back, I think, on the school side anyway. You know, there's multiple components to impact fees. It's not just schools. There's parks and roads and public buildings, other things. But from a district perspective, when we first passed the sales tax in 2004, I think that was part of the reason we didn't pursue an impact fee increase. And then you had the Great Recession and the housing market tank, and they actually lowered impact fees, including school impact fees, because they didn't want to do anything that would hurt the housing market further. That has since changed. You know, the housing market has recovered. But we didn't, you know, this study of impact fees was commissioned by the county. They brought in a consultant firm, Tyndall Oliver. They looked at impact fees in their totality. It wasn't just the school board trying to push to get an increase. So those recommendations have come back, and you know, the findings are, if you look at the most prevalent impact fee, we're at about $1,800. The study said we need to be closer to like $6,153. And if you look at the rest of the state, that's much more in line where other counties are for school impact fees. So I think it's timely. You know, there's a lot of development planned within our county. The sales tax, what I would tell people about the sales tax, I'd say, look, we were pretty transparent about that. We said, look, we lost local capital authority. We lost $1 billion basically in revenue that we should have had. We amassed this huge backlog of deferred maintenance, and that penny sales tax is for local government infrastructure. It's for to really fix the existing infrastructure. Impact fees are to help when new people move into the county, to help them pay part of the bill of providing the roads and schools and everything that's going to be needed to serve them. So, you know, the county commission gets to make that decision, whether it's approved or not. We're knowledgeable about the process. We were supportive. We would welcome the revenue because it would help us meet some of our facility demands that we see in the 10-year horizon. And at this point, you know, they're going to, I think, have a public hearing in mid-January. And there is, the way the county commission presented the agenda item yesterday was providing a 2-year phase-in, with April 1st, 2019 being the first 50% of the increase, and then a year later it would go to the recommended rate. But the county commission is not bound by that study. They can do whatever they want with it. They could say, look, the current recommendation is to implement pass on 95% of the recommended increase. There was talk yesterday about, well, maybe we should only do 60% or what have you. So
Mrs. Brill?
Just
maybe
as a
one more
follow-up?
thing,
Okay.
just for the board to consider, because I'm sure you're going to get questions probably about this from your constituents. One real nice thing about the impact fee revenue is it's a local source, and it would be exempt from the state requirement to have approval for an ed plant survey. So if we wanted to use our impact fees to build the new school, the board has more power and more flexibility.
And just as a follow-up, so for my colleagues, and maybe they will reduce the amount because, and I know there are many components of the impact fee and different percentages, but there were some areas that went up over 400% for the county, and I believe if I'm correct, and I know we were very low, but that our increase is 242% or something like that.
That's correct.
And so I think that unfortunately we should be prepared as a board to have answers, and hopefully you can counsel us on it, because we're going to be pulled into the mix with the county as people go to the county complaining about it. And me in particular, having the 55-plus communities popping up all over, I know that I'm going to be hearing from a lot of them as well, since there are no schools involved. So hopefully you can come back to us and give us some more information in a way, or maybe some talking points for when the questions do come up. Thank you.
I will. Thank you.
Mrs. Andrews?
Thank you. And Mr. Burke, it is bad news. We heard the same news just last week in Tampa. And so, we have the Superintendents Association, the School Boards Association, we have all of our groups, smaller groups in our different districts talking the same talk. Now, you go to your meetings. I know we have the legislative meeting that's coming up within a week or so. Is there any way that we can get the notes and the information that you're getting as you talk to those other districts that are sitting at the table with you about what they fear the greatest issues are? We probably know what they are, but sometimes there's some other kind of conversation coming. So when you go to your finance group, do you go there 2 or 3 times a year, and how does that work where we can get some of that information?
Yes, it's twice a year. I actually serve on the Finance Council, which is like a subset of all the districts, but we do every year our legislative budget priorities, and we presented that to the state board. Some of the big ones were to allow the RLE to require local effort to grow naturally with the increase in property values. This compression adjustment, but yeah, I'd be happy to share that. I did share some of that with Ms. Schuyler as she put together the board's priorities. You'll see a little footnote that some of that language aligns with the finance officers. I'd be happy
I
to
would
share
just
that.
like to meet with you more on that, because, we're all saying the same thing. We're interfacing with all of the different board members across the state and the finance people and the superintendent, so we're all on the same page. But maybe as we walk through this whole piece, if you could just kind of keep us alert as to what's going on, from the other
Absolutely.
standpoints. But it may be the same as what we're hearing.
Thanks. Can I go back to one more thing on the impact fees, just real quick? That example of a senior living, senior community, that's one community that'd be exempt from the school impact fee. So that may help a little bit.
Dr. Robinson?
Thank you. So when will we start hiring the additional MTSS/behavior coaches that the voters have approved?
Right. So the voters have approved this levy. It'll be part of next year's budget, which means we don't really see the money till July of 2019. So really next school year, we'll have the ability to start budgeting these new positions. And that's it's going to be part of. I imagine being in front of you soon in another workshop, probably with more details on what those allocations, what we want to recommend. But I've got some work to do with Mr. Oswald and the superintendent and team. We've scheduled some time in January already to really dig into this, and we just want to make sure we've got everything tightened up and make the best use of those dollars.
Okay, thank you.
Mrs. Andrews?
Just to follow back up, I think Dr. Fenoy said that he's going to make it transparent so that when you get the information, as what Dr. Robinson has said, as well as all the other things that we're getting based on the referendum, that you're going to have it somewhere where it can be fluid and we can follow it, the community can follow it, parents, everybody can follow exactly when the money's coming, how it's being spent, and so on.
Absolutely, and we're bound to do that for the Independent Referendum Oversight Committee. And that group's already, those meetings are scheduled. It's actually, committee's been in place looking after the quarter mill, so they'll step right into the full mill. And you'll ultimately approve, by approving the budget, you'll approve really the spending of that 1 mill.
Okay.
So I'd like to go back and address the impact fees again. So I've had these conversations with the county commissioners for the last several years. We need to fight on this. With all due respect to Mrs. Brill, the developer adds that cost to the home. The homes out in the West Delray area, I mean, every piece of land available is being built on by the different developers out there, and there is no land available for us to build a school. Those impact fees is what we would use to build a school for the thousands of children that are coming from those homes. Not only that, but the city of Boca Raton sold the golf course, which is on Glades Road, which is another development that's planned for single-family homes with children. The Johns property, which is next to Olympic Heights, is, I don't know how many 100 acres are there that will eventually go for residential development with the more homes. There are no more, Mrs. Brill's district is already pouring children into my district schools because they're all at capacity. We need to fight on these impact fees because it's the West Delray, the West Boynton area drastically needs schools, and there's just no more room. I mean, the kids are all coming down to the South region, filling up the schools in Boca, and as everybody knows, we have no more room in those schools. So we need to lobby, and I would suggest to all of you to go meet with the county commissioners and explain to them that, years ago, the developers had to set aside land for us to build a school on. Well, there's the bridges and there's the Oaks, and all those developments on 441 are brand new homes. They're 10 feet apart that cost $800, $900 million, and there's not a stitch of land anywhere in any of those developments for schools, and all those homes have children. So we should all be meeting individually with the county commissioners, having them not only look at the study for the $6,000, which is like I think, isn't Orange County a $10,000 impact fee?
Yeah, Orange, Osceola, Seminole are like in the $9,000 to $10,000 range.
So we're so far, we're at 1,900, 18 something.
1,800 right now.
And Orange is collecting $10,000 per home. So we need to actually get to the county commissioners and tell them, we need have money to build schools for all of the developments that they are approving, and they need to raise the impact fee so that we have the money from these homes so we can do that. Mrs. Brill?
Thank you. And so that's the kind of stuff that we need in the talking points, but also to find out, what I want to know is, can we fight for that piece while they tweak the other pieces? Like if they reduce the impact fees, what they were talking about the other day, because some of the county commissioners felt that the amount was too much, are we treated separately? Those are the pieces I don't understand. Our 242% doesn't even put us on parity with other counties, but, can we keep that piece whole while they reduce the other pieces? So I really need to know how that works, and so that when we do speak to the county commission, and maybe these are, it's going to be time that we may have to show up at those county commission meetings when they have that discussion.
Okay. We'll follow up.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you, sir. At this time, I will have the Education Foundation Workshop, Mr. James Gravelos, and the President, CEO,